All right, we are in Romans chapter 1. And before we go into this, I just want to give you a real quick review of what we've done the last few weeks, because I think it's really important, especially if you just came in. Like I said, Romans builds. We know that in chapters 1 through 11 of Romans, the Apostle Paul, who, by the way, is writing this letter to Gentile and Jewish Christians alike who have become Christians, and now they're living in Rome, and they're being persecuted greatly. I mean, they're being killed, they're being tortured by law. People are allowed to do terrible things to them, and so Paul, who doesn't know these people, he hasn't been to Rome as the kind of current leader of the Christian world. So he writes this letter to explain to them what it's all about, to encourage them and help them be confident in their faith, as we looked at last week. But in the first 11 chapters, he says, this is what we're supposed to believe. This is what we believe because of this. And in the last few chapters, he goes, this is how we're to behave. In what we've just done up to verse 18 is Paul's introduction. And in that, he talks about how much his life has changed now that he's a Christian. And this week, and next week, we're going to be looking at the problem with sin. And Paul's going to be laying out the case for this is why we need Jesus Christ. It's not something that you can do on your own because of the sin, the problem with sin that we have in our life. And then after that, he's going to go in chapter 3, starting verse 21, he's going to go into the solution of the salvation through our faith. In the last few weeks, we've looked at stuff that we really need to know, Paul says. He says that it's important as a Christian that we believe that Jesus really lived a fully human life while he was still fully God, that Jesus died voluntarily, it was part of the plan, that Jesus came back to life from the grave, he was resurrected. He brought God's grace and love to everyone, Jews, Gentile, young, old, black, white, red, everybody on the planet. Christianity is not a new religion. Remember, it's a continuation, it's a fulfillment of the Old Testament and the Old Testament prophecies. And we know that when we become Christians, we are changed from the inside out. We become reborn, the Bible says, spiritually, and we are changed to be holy people, holy nation, a royal priesthood. Our job, holy, means we've been set aside to do the work of God. And then last week we looked at different reasons to be confident that this good news is from God and about God. And now Paul is going into this problem that we have. And the reason that we need Jesus to have a relationship with God, it's because there's sin in our life. And what we're going to see in these next few verses is that we're going to see a contrast between good and bad. And we're going to see the life with God as compared to the life without God, or the life in the light as compared to the life in the dark, or the life of righteousness as compared to the life of wicked or evil or separated from God or ungodliness. So I wanted to start with the beginning first. Y'all have heard of the book of Genesis? We're going to go back there for just a second, because we're going to show some things in the beginning. You've got to realize that even though God is all-powerful and all-knowing, and he knew all of this was going to go down, and he knew that Adam and Eve was going to sin and all that kind of stuff, we also know that he created man and he created the earth as being perfect. So let me just give you a couple of verses that are very important. First of all, it's important that we understand as human beings, you, me, us, we, everybody on this planet, look at Genesis 1, verse 27. So God created human beings how? In his own image. Now, I don't know about you, but that's pretty cool. In his own image, he created us. In the image of God, he created them, both male and female, God created them. Then we go down to Genesis 2. Chapter 2, verse 25. Now the man and his wife were both naked. Now that'll get a lot of attention right off the bat. You know what I'm saying? They were both naked, but it was no big deal. You know why? Because there was no shame, there was no sin. It was man and women being who they're supposed to be together. That's how it started. That's how it all started out. And then the Bible says in verse 31, that God looked over all that he had made, and he saw that it was very good. Let's go back just a second to verse 25 again, Genesis 2. It's important. I would circle no shame. See, no shame is what comes with confidence in your security and in your righteousness, which, remember, we talked about last week, that the Apostle Paul says, I'm not ashamed of the gospel. I feel good about it. I sleep good at night. I have no problem at all in sharing this good news with people. And what happens is, and you can look at your own lives and you realize when you're closest to God, would you agree with this? When you're closest to God and you feel best about how you're living out your life in obedience and according to His will, isn't there less shame in your life? Don't you just feel more confident? Don't you just have a feeling of, well, that's how it was created to be? And with Adam and Eve at the very beginning, they're running around and they're not ashamed of either one of them knowing anything about each other or their relationship with God. Their relationship was so close to God that there's a verse in there that says they heard God walking through the garden. I mean, dude, they are hanging out with God, and there's no shame at all. They feel very good about that. I guarantee if we're sitting in here today, even though we're Christians and we have the righteousness from God, even though we have that, yet we still sin every day, I promise you, if Jesus walked through that back door today, we probably wouldn't be running up and asking Him for His autograph. There would be a sense of embarrassment and shame that would come to us in His presence. God looked over and He said, this is very good. And then, look what's next. But, you ready? Man was tempted to choose self over God. Now, I think this is a problem that man's had from the very beginning when that temptation comes to be God. Remember, whose image are we made in? We're made in God's image. So we have a natural bent to be more like God. Well, remember, that's what Lucifer got in trouble for. That's why he ended up being prince of the earth and being Satan, because him and a third of the angels decided they could be like God too. So that's something that we do. And when this time of temptation, and you have to almost think that maybe there wasn't any temptation up to this point. I don't know. You know, one of the things that happens is when we're tempted and we survive that temptation and we continue to do the right thing, we get better at it and better at it and better at it. Just like when we fall into temptation, we get better at falling into temptation because we practice it. But man was tempted to choose himself over God, and who did he choose? Moi. Look what it says. And I want you to pay attention. I underlined a couple of very important words here, because I want you to realize as we're talking about one of the things that we have to realize about sin, and we're going to be talking about some pretty heavy-duty sins. Next week, we're going to hit on a sin that's one of the most popular talked about sins in the world right now that everybody is talking about, and even a favorite chicken restaurant had to deal with it just not too long ago. So we're going to be talking about that. But one of the things that I want you to realize when we talk about sin is that we do it because we think it's okay. And when you're a non-believer and you're not being, when you're a non-believer, you're not allowing yourself to be guided by God, and you're separated from and away from God, and especially if you continue to do some kind of sin over and over and over again, what happens is you build a hardness, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit more later on in the message, but you come to the point where you start justifying and believing it's okay to continue doing that. So there's people in your lives right now that have sin in their life no matter what it is, messing around with other women, do whatever they're doing, and they just believe that because of whatever the circumstances are in their life that's just okay, or maybe I don't think it's okay, but I'll fix it later. One of the things you got to remember is because we're built in God's image, we have a certain moral compass that's already in there. And I find that even when I talk to people who say they don't believe in God, they have some deep anxiety and pain that goes with things they do that they just know from inside that it's wrong. But look, here's what the snake has come into the garden. Okay? And the snake is the enemy, is Satan, right? The prince of this world, the prince of darkness. He comes in and he talks to Eve and he tricks her. He says, Eve, did God really say that you couldn't eat any of this fruit? You remember that conversation? And Eve looked at him confused and said, no, it was really this one here in the middle of the garden. And so the devil goes a little bit further and he says basically, don't you think God would want you to be like him? See, there's where that lie is starting already. And then look what happens. The woman was... Okay, I'm going to say the woman was again and point at you. And we'll say convinced together. Because I want you to understand. Okay, ready? The woman was... Dude, she was convinced. She just remember we look at these people who are so close to God and we go, how could you do that? How could you be running around naked? You had it made. You were in the garden and you were with God and life was good and nobody was gossiping or cheating on you or stealing from you or anything like this. And you lived in this perfect life and all of a sudden you let this snake talk you into disobeying God because he made you believe that you could be better than you already were, even though you were in a perfect state or condition. So she saw that the tree was beautiful and its fruit looked delicious, and she wanted the wisdom that it would give her. See, that's the trick that the devil uses all the time. As he tries to convince us that worldly wisdom is better than God's wisdom, we look at things. Remember, we think ways that we think is human are right, but they lead to death because they're wrong. So, right after that, Adam came up and did what all men do. He did what his wife told him, and he ate the fruit, and now we're dead. You know what I'm saying? So, Eve chose self, man chose self, and here's where it starts. And this is the beginning of man devolving. We make such a big deal. We live in a world that evolution is passed off as science. Man started off as scum of the earth, and we've built up into scum of the earth that walks on two legs. But we're a whole lot better than we were that kind of scum on the earth. But man believes in evolution. But what God teaches is that man started off in a perfect state, in a good state, and because of ourselves, we've devolved. We've devolved. It's the opposite of evolving. It's shrinking. Man is made in God's image. From the beginning, the temptation was for man to be better. Man could be better if he chose for himself. He could better if he was in his own driver's seat. Man could be better if he could trust in himself. Man was resistant to letting God be in charge of his life. Look, I talk to people all the time that the main thing that's holding them back is they like to be in charge of their own life. Let me just tell you a truth, okay? You're really not in charge of a whole lot. If your body decides tomorrow you're going to have a stroke, you could be in bed not being in charge of anything for a long time. You're in charge of the way you think. You're in charge of the way you respond. But man, we just have this sense, this feeling. That's why there's so much anxiety. That's why there's so much depression. That's why pride is a thing that gets between us and God. Is we believe that we have this resistance to having complete trust in God and letting God be in charge. So instead of drawing our source and all the truth that comes from the King of Kings, the author of truth, we choose to listen to the father of lies, to the prince of this world. He just, the devil, here's the thing we have to realize, and this is why people say they don't believe, a very large percentage of people say they don't believe in the devil. They don't believe that he's an actual being. You know why? He's done such a good job disguising himself as an angel of light. We do crazy, stupid, silly things like disobey God because the devil has talked us into believing that it's the best thing for us to do. I don't have this one in your notes, but in verse 4 of Genesis 3, the devil said, "Are you kidding me?" He said, "You won't die." He said, God knows that your eyes will be open as soon as you eat it, and you will be like God, knowing both good and evil. Now that sounded pretty good to Eve. We were created in God's image. And because of that, we have a tendency toward wanting to be more like God, wanting to be our own God. And the further we get away from the light, and this is where this is going to go as Paul makes his case. The further we get away from the light, the further we get away from God, the darker it gets, the more perverted we get in our thinking, the more perverted we get in worshiping other things instead of God, and the more we become immoral in our relationship with God and our relationship with other people. Man devolves lower and lower and lower. It's in direct consequence to the way man pulls away. You know how I've talked a lot about the fact that men and women, we live our lives, we want to be as close to God as possible, but we also want to do what we think would be more fun, so we try to stay just far away from God that we don't feel like we've abandoned Him, but we can still kind of do what we want to do. Remember last week we talked about God calling that lukewarm and how bad that was for our relationship with Him. But the further we get away from Him, the more we devolve to be lower and lower and lower. And what ends up happening is things that have always been wrong, that God says they're wrong, we all of a sudden start thinking that they're right. This must be right. And then look what Genesis 3 verse 6 and 7 says. So she took some of the fruit and ate it, and then she gave some to her husband who was with her, and he ate it too. Then look what it says. At that moment, their eyes were open, and they suddenly what? Felt shame. Shame only comes from sin. You know, it's amazing. For years as a counselor, I would counsel people that weren't Christians, and there were certain things that they were doing that they just knew they were wrong. They didn't read that in the Bible. It was just in them. They know this is wrong. But God makes a way for us to be right. After all that, and after Adam and Eve, and all that time where after God made the Hebrew people His people and everything else, God laid out, He made sure that we understood that we couldn't live by the law. The law isn't the thing that could save us. And then Jesus came along, and then Paul writes his introduction. In verse 17, he says, ready? This good news tells us how God makes us right in His sight. This is accomplished from start to finish by all the good things that you do. You catch that? By what? By faith. As the Scriptures say, it is through faith that a righteous person has life. And then there's another but. You ready? But Paul has just given this introduction. He's just given the crux, the center of what Romans is all about, what the good news is all about, and then he comes back with all this good stuff. Man is made right by God, by faith. He's been changed. He's brand new. But verse 18, God shows His anger, His wrath, it says in the NIV, from heaven against all sinful, godless people who suppress the truth by their wickedness. In other words, man knows that God is God, but we suppress the truth by living out ungodly lives. As much as God loves us, look, we've got to understand something. He despises sin. Sin can't be in His righteous presence. That's why He went to such a big deal being incarnated into a human being and coming down here and living this life and all to lay out for us so that we can be righteous. God loves us, but He hates sin. Holiness and evil cannot be together. People have suppressed the truth of God by their lack of reverence for God or their ungodliness. So Paul sets out to convince people how far from God they are, and they continue to devolve. Man believes in evolution, but God teaches and believes that man has devolved. And we're going to see when we get to verse 24. We're going to finish with verse 24 today. But verse 24 says that basically the wrath of God manifests itself in the place where the way God... And it's real hard when you see things like God is angry and you see things like God's wrath. You have to realize as human beings, when we start putting human characteristics on God, it's not the same thing. It's just like when we talk about human love, it's not anywhere close to the kind of love that we got with God. When we talk about human trust, it's not anywhere. You know what I'm saying? It's just different. So when you look at the wrath of, we know that God's not going around frying us. I mean, how many times have you sinned this week and you got away with it? A bunch, right? I mean, some of you this morning, before you even took a breath, you had a bad thought or whatever. And the law shows us that. But the wrath of God shows up. It says in verse 24 and several other places, the wrath of God shows up in the fact that God gives us over to ourselves. He says, okay, if you're not going to give me control, then okay. You got it. But you're going to have to suffer whatever the consequences are that go with that. So we suppress God's truth when we decide to worship ourselves. We decide to start worshiping the created instead of the Creator. We replace God with things like success and property and wealth. We decide to base our truths on what we think as a man are the truths instead of what God's truths are. And we just ignore God's claim on our lives, and we take control of our own lives. So let's just see what Paul says about our choices as a man and how God makes himself visible just by the world in which we live in. Number one is this. You ready? Man knows but rejects God. Man knows but rejects God. Man replaces God, and the light of God makes man uncomfortable to his sin. Like I said, I've talked to lots of people who don't know God, don't know the Bible, and they just have this sense, this feeling that when I was a counselor, because I was good at what I did, and I taught godly, righteous principles, I would get people who were agnostics or Buddhists or atheists. They came to me for counseling all the time. They didn't come to me because I was a Christian counselor, and that's how I advertised myself. They came to me because it worked. We heard you saved our friend's marriage. We heard that you did this. We heard that. What happens is when you start teaching godly principles and people start listening, they kind of know in their gut that that's right. They fight it. I mean, who wants to be wrong? Nobody wants to be wrong, especially if you've lived like that your whole life. We know down in our gut, down in our soul, as we've been made in the image of God. Look what verse 19 says. They know the truth about God. Why? Because He has made it so obvious to them. For ever since the world was created, people have seen the earth, they've seen the sky. Through everything God made, they can clearly see His invisible qualities, His eternal power, His divine nature, so they have no excuse for not knowing God. Now, I want to tell you something. This is the verse I use. I really believe there's no such thing as atheists. Now, you might have an atheist in your family, or you might be an atheist here, and you say that I'm wrong. I want to tell you something. I believe the Bible teaches there's no such thing as atheists. I think atheism is a sin just like any other sin when we reject God. We have to justify it. Now, I've talked to quite a few atheists in my life. They are mostly angry people. And they have to be to deal with that. Because they're dealing with something all the time that they know just from looking around and seeing what God's done and seeing God working in other people and knowing deep down into their soul. I believe that what an atheist is somebody who rejects the existence of God. Now, they're going to argue with you and call you stupid. There's plenty of YouTube videos that have about 10 million views of people that are calling Christians stupid. But I promise you, I love telling atheists about God. When they start yelling at me, they are uncomfortable. Because I don't approach them like a mean Christian does. I approach them as if I understand where they're coming from and I can feel what you feel, but I explained to them the truths of God. And I tell you what, I would much rather witness to an angry atheist than an apathetic agnostic. An agnostic, somebody on the fence. Most atheists, I think, are atheists because something has happened in their life that's made them ticked off enough that the only way they can deal with it is they have to pretend that there's no such thing as a God. And the only way they can feel good about is by trying to make you look more stupid than they are. But agnostics, on the other hand, most agnostics that I've met, they're people that have been around people who know God, and they knew God at one point in their life, and they got very disappointed in seeing the way we go about being God's love with skin. To the point where they watch their parents and they watch other people and they go, you know, God must not be very relevant to you, so He's not going to be to me. So they become agnostics. And I'm telling you, when you talk to an agnostic, you have to overcome all the sorry God believers they've ever been around. And that's why I think it's more difficult even than talking to an atheist. I'll take an angry atheist every day. If I can keep my patience down and stand on them almost spitting in my face, it's way easier to talk to them than it is to talk to an agnostic who just kind of blows off everything they say, because they've witnessed things that have made them believe that God's not very important in most people's lives. But what Paul is saying here is that God has revealed Himself through creation, and He's revealed Himself through conscience. It says here that God has made it plain, He's made it visible, He's made it intangible, He's made it intelligible, He's made it constant, He's made it eternal, He's made it divine. I mean, you can look at the consistency of God and the things around you. I've told y'all this story before. The first time I ever saw the mountains of Colorado, I thought, how can anybody see this and not believe God? When you see your baby being born, how can anybody believe that? You know what I'm saying? God shows Himself over and over and over and over again. And then I love the word here for creation. It's the same word that's used in Ephesians 2:10 when we're called God's masterpiece. The word here is poema. You know what that means? It's where we get our word poem. It's the beauty of a poem. I mean, God spoke beauty. We're a part of this epic creation of God, this masterpiece. And God just spoke it, and it happened, and everything fell into place. And there's just enough oxygen, and the world spins just enough, and it's tilted just right so it don't burn up. And all of this kind of stuff that God has just put all into action. And this plays off this, and this plays off this. And isn't that incredible? You know, if you've ever created a masterpiece, you love that masterpiece. And you struggle when something happens to it to mess it up. And that's what we're dealing with God. This creation that God has made, this epic poem that we're a part of. Jesus speaks, and the earth, the sky, the animals, oxygen, water, people, it all comes together as this one epic poem. And in this poem, there's the perfect beginning. There's the dark middle that we're a part of now. And then there's the perfect ending that's going to come. And when man and God are back together and the earth is made new with heaven, we're going to be to our perfect eternal ending. The Bible teaches us that there's no reason for not believing in God, that people either accept God or reject God. And when you're talking to that angry atheist that you know, you have to realize that because of wherever they're at in their head, they've justified that that's right. And you're not going to win it with an argument. You're only going to win it the way God won you, with love. That's the key to all. So, man knows but rejects God. And then number 2, rejection of God leads to darkness and confusion. The rejection of God leads to darkness and confusion. It's devolution of intelligence. It's devolving in the way we think and the way we feel. And that we talk a lot about the closer we get to God and the more we get to know God and the more we follow God, the more we pray according to His will, the more we do things according to His will, the more we're who God wants us to be, the more we become like God. Look at verse 21. Yes, Paul writes, they knew God, but they wouldn't worship Him as God or even give Him thanks. And they began to think up foolish ideas of what God was like. As a result, their minds became what? Dark and confused, claiming to be wise. They instead became utter fools. I was talking to a guy this last week that I haven't seen in years. And we reconnected on Facebook, and he wanted to have lunch. And he said, you know what, Roy, I hadn't been to church in years, and I'm trying to get back to God, and I just want to tell you something. I read the Bible, and I don't even understand it. You know why? Because he's been separated from God so long that he's confused. He's in darkness. It's hard to understand the truth that comes from the Spirit. So, I coached him to get connected back with God and spend some time in prayer, and gave him a couple of easy chapters to start off with. And I'm looking forward to hearing where he's coming from. But you guys know what I mean. When you're farthest away from God and you're trying to read your Bible, isn't it more difficult? Isn't it harder to understand? And when you're closer to God, doesn't it feel good? I mean, you're reading it and you go, oh my, I've never seen that before. That is a life-changing thing. I mean, I've got it underlined and striped and everything else, but I've never seen that part of it, because when you're close to God, what happens is the Holy Spirit starts counseling you and helps you understand. And wherever you're at in your life, you read this and you go, the confusion goes away, clarity. That's why it's so important that when we get that clarity, when we see that, we act on that just not be head knowledge, that we take that head knowledge and we make it wisdom by living it out. He said they began to think up foolish ideas. As a result, they instead became utter fools. When we refuse to worship God and give Him thanks, we spiral down as we devolve to a lower and lower being, into darkness and in pride. And when God says things and does things and points things out, we don't recognize them. There's that verse, Proverbs 14:12. There is a path before each person that what? Seems right, doesn't it? It sure seems right, but it ends in death. What happened to Adam and Eve? The woman was convinced. She saw that the tree was beautiful and its fruit looked delicious. She wanted the wisdom that it would give her. And we've got to ask ourselves, why do we sin? We sin because we reject God and it leads to sin. We devolve spiritually. We fall into sexual sin, greed, hatred, envy, fighting, lying, bitterness, gossip. Have I stepped on everybody's toes yet? Because I have mine. You know what I'm saying? We blame others. We blame circumstances. We justify what we do. It seems right. It seems easier at the time. Why do we lie? Because it seems easier at the time. Why do we hate? Because we justify. We ought to be able to hate that person. That person's the kind of person you're supposed to hate. We justify fights. We justify bitterness. We justify hatred. We don't forgive because they don't deserve to be forgiven. And I saw this as a counselor all the time. I was counseling a lady one time who had one affair after another. She was married and she had one affair after another, just constantly. She'd been sexually abused as a child, and she believed that her husband didn't love her, and she believed the only way to get love was to go out and have sex with other people. She believed that. And when I started seeing her as a client, she was being used and abused by a guy that she'd barely met because she believed that that was the only way that she could get love. She told me once, I know God sent this man into my life because I'm so miserable. Isn't that messed up? We would all say that's messed up, but that's an extreme. We look at all the other things. We get dark. We reject God. We reject the truths of God. You've got to ask yourself, what sin in your life are you justifying? You know it's wrong, whether it's a sin that you're committing or something that you're omitting from your life that God's telling you to do. Are you justifying it for financial reasons? Are you living in sin right now and doing what you're doing because of financial reasons? And you just believe that this is what I need to do because it's the only way that I can handle my financial situation. Or are you doing it because it just seems easier to do you? Or is it because life is hard and this just makes you feel better? Do you treat Him this way because that's the way He treats me? Do you hold on to bitterness because I want Him to pay? We're going to get married anyway, so we might as well be doing this now. What sin are you justifying in your life? You know it's wrong. And the closer you get to God, the more it bothers you. But I told you I was going to be stepping on some toes. I'm stepping on mine as I talk to you. The sin that you're justifying is keeping you out of God's light. And it's keeping you in the darkness of this world. Do you realize what you're missing out on because of that? It seems right, but there's a way that seems a lot right to man, and it leads to death. See, you're listening to that snake, and he is so convincing. Number 3, devolution from worshiping the creation instead of the Creator. Look at verse 23. This is a little hard to understand because it didn't fit into our culture, but I'm going to give you some things to fit in there with it. And instead of worshiping the glorious, ever-living God, they worshipped idols made to look like mere people and birds and animals and reptiles. Here's a question. What are the idols in your life that you think are more important to God? And I just put down a few, and you need to spend some time in prayer and figure out what those things are. Money may be, popularity may be, success may be, comfort may be, fun may be, power, security. All of those things may be what you put in front of God. And you've got to look. And when you read God's Word and when you know the things that you're doing are wrong, you've got to look at your life and you've got to say, what am I putting in front of my relationship with God? And then I want to end with this verse because this is where we're going to start next week. Would you hang with me next week? I know this has been really hard, but next week it's going to get harder. But then the next week you're going to go, whew. Because the next week I'll give you relief. I promise you. And I hope that the conviction will just encourage you to be a better person than you are, myself included. Look at verse 24. This is the definition of the wrath of God. So God abandoned them to do whatever shameful things their hearts desired. So let's just go. As a church, we finish up our service with what we call a time with God. And it's a time to pray about what you've maybe were convicted of today or listening to what God would have you. I would go ahead. I hope you're reading ahead.